Nice just starting as a dog barking outside. Very wonderful. I may have fallen asleep for 20 minutes. That's okay. We're all good. Power naps don't work for me. I'm a bit more tired now. But you know what? It's only 9 pages left. Ish. 9 and like this 2 paragraphs. I can power through. Resilience. Let's go. A cultural renaissance. On page 868, in case you don't know where. Yes, cultural renaissance. America's unprecedented global power in the heady post-World War II decades is matched by its new international ascendancy in the arts. Shedding the national inferiority complex that had vexed previous generations, American creative genius exerted a powerful worldwide influence in painting, architecture, and literature. New York became the art capital of the world after World War II. As well-heeled Americans supported countless painters and sculptors. The tradition-free American environment seems especially congenial to the experimental mood of much modern art, which probed the underbelly of contemporary life, including how widespread material wealth challenged traditional American values. Jackson Pollock pioneered abstract expressionism in the 40s and 50s, dripping paint on huge flats stretched across the studio floor. Realistic representation went out the window as artists like Pollock and William de Kooning strove to create spontaneous action paintings that expressed the painter's individuality and made the viewer a creative participant in defining the painting's meaning. Mark Rothko and his few fellow color-field painters dispatched with figurative representation, enveloping whole canvases with bold, shimmering swaths of color. Other artists made creative use of familiar commercial forms. Pop, short for popular artists in the 1960s, notably Andy Warhol, canonized on canvas mundane items of consumer culture like soup cans and soda bottles, while Rory Lichtenstein parodied old-fashioned comic strips. American architecture also reached new heights in the post-war era, while a residential building boom erected vast tracts of look-alike ranch-style houses across the suburban landscape. Ultramodern skyscrapers arose in nation's urban centers. Conceived in the modernist or international style, these massive corporation high-rises, such as New York's United Nations headquarters and Seagram Building, were essentially giant steel boxes wrapped in glass. Other architectural achievements transcended the stark steel and glass box. Old master Frank Lloyd Wright continued to produce strikingly original designs like the round-walled Guggenheim Museum in New York. Louis Kahn employed plain geometric forms and basic building materials like brick and concrete to make beautiful, simple buildings, such as the serene Seaside Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. I'm assuming it's La Jolla. Chinese-born I.M. Pei designed numerous graceful buildings on several college campuses, as well as the dramatic East Wing of the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Anglo John F. Kennedy Library in Boston. Post-war America reaped its greatest cultural harvest in the field of literature. Searing realism characterized the earliest novels that portrayed soldierly life in World War II, such as Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead and James Jones' From Here to Eternity, but as time passed, realistic war writing fell from favor. Authors tended increasingly to write about the war in fantastic and even psychedelic prose. Joseph Heller Savage's satirical Catch-22 dealt with the antics and anguish of American airmen in the wartime Mediterranean. The supercharged imagination of Kurt Vonnegut Jr. poured forth works of puzzling complexity and sometimes inventive prose, including the darkly comical war tale Slaughterhouse-Five. More than the war itself, the fruits of victory at home captured America's literary imagination. At mid-century, the broader culture became engaged as never before with psychological and particularly Freudian concepts, and the post-war pens documented the internal effects of the nation's newly affluent, exuberantly consumerist society. Ouch. One group of countercultural beat writers rejected modern American life outright, seeking the self-expression in stridently nonconformist lifestyles. A larger group of mainstream writers tackled the realities and dilemmas of post-war American society head-on. Pennsylvania-born John Updike celebrated the feats and failings of ordinary... Oh my goddamn tooth. It hurts. Ow! Ordinary small-town America in sensual detail in his Poor Rabbit series, starting with Rabbit Run. Updike went up on... Oh my, I just said the F word. I mean, not like that's... I'm so sorry. I literally just woke up like 5 minutes ago. My head is spinning. I can say the F word. Oh, but like I tried to read Updike. I was trying to read Updike and I said fuck. Like I wasn't just saying fuck out of frustration. I looked at the paper and read Updike and my brain computed it as fuck. And I started to say fuck, went on to address. Updike went on to address suburban middle-class infidelity in couples. Massachusetts-bred John Cheever, the Chekhov of the exurbs, similarly chronicled suburban manners and morals in short stories such as The Swimmer and novels like The Wapshot Chronicle. Gore Vidal penned a series of intriguing historical novels as well as several impish and always in iconoclastical works, including Mirror Breckenridge about the reincarnated transsexual. Together, these writers constituted the rearguard of an older WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite that had long dominated American writing. Poets were often highly critical, even deeply despairing about the conformist character of mid-century American life. In short lyrical meditations, they experimented with a frank confessional style, revealing personal experiences with sex, drugs, and madness, inspired by the Beat Poets. Robert Lowell helped inaugurate his trend with his psychologically intense life studies. Descended from a long line of patrician New Englanders, Lowell sought to apply the wisdom of the Puritan past to the perplexing present in allegorical poems like For the Union Dead. Troubled Sylvia Plath crafted the moving verses of Ariel, published posthumously in 1966, and a disturbing autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, but her career was cut short when she took her own life in 1963. Playwrights are also acute observers of post-war American social mores. Tennessee Williams wrote a series of blistering dramas about psychological misfits struggling to hold themselves together amid the disintegrating forces of modern life. Noteworthy were A Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, each delivering powerful critiques of the contemporary restrictions placed on women's lives. Arthur Miller brought to the stage the searching prose of American values, notably Death of a Salesman, a tragic indictment of the American dream of material success, and The Crucible, which treated the Salem witch trials as a dark parable warning against the dangers of McCarthyism. Lorraine Hansberry offered an affecting, realistic portrait of African-American struggles. In A Raisin in the Sun, Edward Albee exposed the rapacious underside of middle-class life in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. In the same mold as earlier classics like Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, many post-war novels took the form of Bill Doug's Roman, German Reformation novel, or a tale chronicling the education and maturation of a young protagonist. New York novelist and infamous recluse J.D. Salinger painted an unforgettable portrait of an adolescent angst, alienation, and rebellion in The Catcher in the Rye. Ralph Ellison depicted the African American's often tortured quest for personal identity and invisible man, a haunting novel narrated by a nameless black person who finds that none of his supposed supporters could see him as a real man. Chicagoan Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March offered a coming-of-age tale of young everyman struggling to make sense of the chaotic modern world. Alabama novelist Harper Lee drew from the Southern Gothic tradition to tell of racial injustice and to the loss of youthful innocence in the blockbuster To Kill a Mockingbird. My freaking tooth. New cultural voices. Ooh, that hurts. Ooh. Pain. Underrepresented groups gained new prominence in mid-century literary circles. Black authors built on the earlier achievements of the Harlem Renaissance. A decade before Ellison's emergence, Richard Wright had found literary acclaim with his chilling portrait of a black Chicago killer and native son. Excuse me. The book made Wright the first African-American bestseller, and he followed his success with a semi-autobiographical and highly influential black boy. Later, James Baldwin won plaudits as a novelist and essayist, particularly for his sensitive reflections on the racial question in The Fire Next Time. Black nationalist Leroy Jones, who changed his name to Imamu Amiri Baraka, crafted powerful plays like Dutchman. The South boasted its own literary revival, led by veteran Mississippi author William Faulkner, a Nobel recipient in 1950. Distancing themselves from an earlier lost cause literature that had glorified the Antebellum South, Southern Renaissance writers brought a new critical appreciation to the recent subversions of history, racism, and conservatism. Tennessean Robert Penn Warren immortalized Louisiana Politico Huey Long in the novel All the King's Men. Fellow Mississippians Walker Percy and Endore Welty grasped a falling torch from the failing Faulkner, who died in 1962. Along with George and Flannery O'Connor, these later Southern Renaissance writers perceptively tracked the changes reshaping the post-war South. Virginian William Styron confronted the harsh history of his home state in a controversial fictional representation of an 1831 slave rebellion, The Confessions of Nat Turner. Especially bountiful was the harvest of books by Jewish novelists. Some critics quipped that knowledge of Yiddish was becoming necessary to understand much of the dialogue presented in modern American novels. Bernard Malamud rendered a touching portrait of a family of New York Jewish storekeepers and the assistant. Philip Roth wrote comically about young New Jersey suburbanites in Goodbye Columbus, and penned an uproarious account of a sexually obsessed middle-aged New Yorker in Portnoy's Complaint. Kennedy's new frontier spirit. Complacent and comfortable as the 1950s closed, the Americans elected in 1960 a young, vigorous president who pledged to get the country moving again, as John F. Kennedy announced to his string inaugural address on January 20, 20th, 1961, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. Speaking crisply with staccato finger jabs at the air, Kennedy personified the glamour and vitality of the new administration. The youngest president ever elected assembled one of the youngest cabinets, including his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General. 35-year-old Bobby set out, among other reforms, to recast the priorities of the FBI, reshifting its focus from internal security work to organized crime cases and civil rights enforcement. His efforts were stoutly resisted by J. Edgar Hoover, who had served as FBI director longer than the new Attorney General had been alive. Business whiz Robert S. McNamara left the presidency of the Ford Motor Company to take over the Defense Department. Along with other young advisors, many boasting Harvard degrees, these appointees made up an inner circle notable for its aura of brass confidence and self-conscious sophistication. From the outset, Kennedy inspired high expectations, especially among the young. His depiction of America's potential for greatness, a new frontier, quickened patriotic pulses. He brought a warm heart to the Cold War when he proposed the Peace Corps, an army of idealistic and mostly youthful volunteers bringing American know-how to underdeveloped countries. He summoned citizens to service with a clarion call to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But the soaring rhetoric did not quite match the political situation. Kennedy came into the office with fragile Democratic majorities in Congress. Southern Democrats threatened to team up with Republicans and axe new frontier proposals. Kennedy won a first round in his campaign for a more cooperative Congress when he forced an expansion of the all-important House Rules Committee, dominated by conservatives who could have bottled up his entire legislative program. Despite this victory, the new frontier did not expand swiftly. Key medical and educational bills remained stalled in Congress. In 1963, the legislative branch even voted down an administration-endorsed bill slashing income and corporate tax rates to boost the economy. That tax bill hinted at the Kennedy administration's complex relationship with big business. The president intended his support for tax cutting to mollify businessmen wary of big government liberal in the White House. But he could also be a tough negotiator with corporate titans when he wanted to. As seen in the tumultuous talks he led with steel industry bosses and labor leaders to forge a non-inflationary wage agreement in 1962. When steel managers seemed to break faith with the agreement by announcing new price increases, Kennedy called them into the Oval Office carpet and unleashed his Irish temper. Overall, they backed down. Kennedy's new frontier vision also extended to the final frontier. Early in his term, the president promoted a multi-billion-dollar project dedicated, as he put it, to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Though he summoned stirring rhetoric about expanding human possibilities, the moon shot was really a calculated ploy to restore America's international prestige, severely damaged by the Soviet Sputnik successes. $24 billion later, in July 1969, two NASA astronauts triumphantly planted their footprints and the American flag on the moon's dusty surface. As people around the globe huddled around televisions to watch the Apollo mission live, the world had never seemed so small and interconnected, nor the United States so dominant. Foreign flare-ups and flexible response. A few months after settling into the White House in June 1961, the new president met Soviet Premier Khrushchev at Vienna. The tough-talking Soviet leader adopted a belligerent attitude, threatening to make a treaty with East Germany and cut off Western access to Berlin. Though visibly shaken, the president refused to be bullied. The Soviets backed off from their most bellicose threats, but their puppet East German regime suddenly began to construct the Berlin Wall in August 1961, a barbed wire and concrete barrier. It was designed to plug the heavy population drain from East Germany to West Germany through the Berlin Funnel. But to the free world, the Wall of Shame looked like a gigantic enclosure around a prison. The wall stood for almost 3 decades as an ugly scar symbolizing the post-World War II division of Europe into two hostile camps. Kennedy, meanwhile, turned his attention to Western Europe, now miraculously prospering after the tonic of Marshall Plan aid and the growth of the American Encouraged European Economic Community, EEC, the free trade area that later evolved into the European Union. He secured passage of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, authorizing tariff cuts of up to 50% to promote trade with the EEC countries. This act led to the so-called Kennedy Round of tariff negotiations, concluded in 1967. These liberalized trade policies inaugurated a new era of such robustly invigorated international commerce that the new word was coined to describe it: globalization. Special problems for U.S. foreign policy emerged from the worldwide decolonization of European overseas possessions after World War II. Cold War entanglements in these new nations threatened to escalate all too quickly into a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the USSR, a prospect that Kennedy attributed to Secretary Dole's dubious doctrine of massive retaliation. The president felt hamstrung by the knowledge that in a crisis he had the devil's choice between humiliation and nuclear incineration. With Defense Secretary McNamara, he pushed an alternative strategy of flexible response, developing an array of military options that could be precisely matched to the gravity of the crisis at hand. To this end, Kennedy increased spending on conventional military forces and bolstered the Special Forces, Green Berets, specializing in anti-guerrilla fighting. The doctrine of flexible response seemed sane enough, but it too contained lethal logic. It potentially lowered the level at which diplomacy would give way to shooting. It also provided a mechanism for a progressive and possibly endless stepping up the use of force. Vietnam soon presented grisly proof of these pitfalls. The corrupt right-wing government of Ngo Dinh still butchering the names Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon, despite a deluge of American dollars, had ruled shakily since the partition of Vietnam in 1954. With ever more intensity, anti-Diem agitators threatened to topple the pro-American government from power. In a fateful decision late in 1961, Kennedy ordered a sharp increase in the number of military advisors, troops, in South Vietnam. American forces allegedly entered Vietnam to foster political stability, to help protect Diem from the communists long enough to allow him to enact promised social reforms. But the Kennedy administration eventually despaired of the reactionary Diem, and in November 1963 encouraged a successful coup against him. Ironically, the United States thus contributed to precisely the process of political disintegration that its original policy had meant to prevent. Kennedy still told the South Vietnamese that it was their war, but he had made dangerously deep political commitments. By the time of his death, he had ordered more than 15,000 American men into the Asian slaughter pen. A graceful pullout was becoming increasingly difficult. Cuban confrontations. Although the United States regarded Latin America as its backyard, its southern neighbors feared and resented the powerful colossus from the north. In 1961, Kennedy extended the hand of friendship with the Alliance for Progress, Alianza para lo Progreso, I can't read Spanish, hailed as a Marshall Plan for Latin America and intended to quiet communist agitation, but results were disappointing. There was little alliance and even less progress. American handouts had little positive impact on Latin America's immense social problems. President Kennedy also struck below the border with brass knuckles. He had inherited from the Eisenhower administration a CIA-backed scheme to topple Fidel Castro from power by invading Cuba with anti-communist exiles. On April 17, 1961, 100 exiles landed at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. When the ill-starred Bay of Pigs invasion bogged down, Kennedy stood fast in his decision to keep hands off, and the bullet-riddled band of anti-Castroites surrendered. The Bay of Pigs blunder, along with the continuing American covert efforts to assassinate Castro and overthrow his government, naturally pushed the Cuban leader even further into the Soviet embrace. Wily Chairman Khrushchev lost little time in taking full advantage of his Cuban comrade's location just 90 miles off Florida's coast. In October 1962, aerial photographs by American spy planes revealed that the Soviets were secretly and speedily installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. Kennedy and Khrushchev now began a nerve-wracking game of nuclear chicken. The president flatly rejected Air Force proposals for a surgical bombing strike against the missile-launching sites. Instead, on October 22, 1962, he ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded immediate removal of the threatening weaponry. He also served notice on Khrushchev that any attack on the United States from Cuba would trigger nuclear retaliation against the Russian heartland. For an anxious week, Americans waited while Soviet ships approached the patrol line established by the U.S. Navy off the island of Cuba. The world teetered breathlessly on the brink of global atomization. Only in 1991 did the full dimensions of the nuclear peril become known, when the Russians revealed that their ground forces in Cuba already had operational nuclear weapons at their disposal and were authorized to launch them if attacked. In this tense eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, Khrushchev finally flinched. On October 28th, he agreed to a partially face-saving compromise by which he would pull the missiles out of Cuba. The U.S. in return agreed to end the quarantine and not invade the island. The American government also quietly signaled that it would remove from Turkey some of its own missiles targeted at the Soviet Union. Fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis was considerable. A disgraced Khrushchev was ultimately hounded out of the Kremlin and became an unperson. Wow. Hardliners in Moscow, vowing to never again be humiliated in a nuclear face-off, launched an enormous program of military expansion. Kennedy, apparently sobered by the appalling risk he had just run, pushed harder for a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. After prolonged negotiations in Moscow, a pact prohibiting trial nuclear explosion in the atmosphere was signed in late 1963. Another barometer indicating a thaw in the Cold War was the installation in August 1963 of a Moscow-Washington hotline, permitting immediate teletype communication in case of a crisis. Most significant was Kennedy's speech at American University in Washington, D.C. in June 1963. The president urged Americans to abandon a view of the Soviet Union as a devil-ridden land filled with fanatics and instead to deal with the world as it is, not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. Kennedy thus tried to lay the foundation for a realistic policy of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. Here were the modest origins of the policy that later came to be known as the Détente, French for relaxation of tension. The struggle for civil rights. Kennedy had campaigned with strong appeal to black voters, but he proceeded gingerly to redeem his promises on civil rights. Political concerns stayed his hand. Elected by a wafer-thin margin, Kennedy needed the support of Southern legislators to pass his economic and social legislation, especially his medical and educational bills. He believed that those measures would eventually benefit black Americans at least as much as specific legislation on civil rights. Bold moves for racial justice would have to wait. But events soon scrambled these careful calculations. After the wave of sit-ins that surged across the South in 1960, groups of freedom riders fanned out to end segregation in facilities serving interstate bus passengers. A white mob torched a freedom ride bus near Anniston, Alabama in May 1961, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy's personal representative native was beaten unconscious in another anti-freedom ride riot in Montgomery. When Southern officials proved unwilling or unable to stem the violence, Washington dispatched federal marshals to protect the freedom riders. Reluctantly but faithfully, the Kennedy administration had now joined hands with the civil rights movement. Because of the partnership, the Kennedys proved ultra wary about the political associates of Martin Luther King Jr., fearful of embarrassing revelations that some of King's advisors had communist affiliations. Robert Kennedy ordered FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to wiretap King's phone in late 1963. But for the most part, the relationship between King and the Kennedys was a fruitful one. Encouraged by Robert Kennedy and with financial backing from Kennedy private foundations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other civil rights groups inaugurated the voter education project to register the South's historically disfranchised blacks. Integrating Southern universities was as challenging as registering African Americans to vote. Some desegregated painlessly, but the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, became a volcano. A 29-year-old Air Force veteran, James Meredith, encountered violent opposition when he attempted to register in October 1962. In the end, President Kennedy was forced to send in 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enroll Meredith in his first class in colonial American history. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a campaign against discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama, the most segregated big city in America. Previous attempts to crack the city's rigid racial barriers had produced more than 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks since 1957. Some of the people sitting here will not come back alive from this campaign, King advised his organizers. Events soon confirmed this grim prediction of violence. Watching developments on television screens in a horrified world saw peaceful civil rights marchers repeatedly repelled by police with attack dogs and electric cattle prods. High-pressure hoses shot water at the demonstrators with enough force to knock bricks loose from buildings or strip bark from trees. Little children were bowled down the street like tumbleweeds. Jolted by these vicious confrontations, President Kennedy delivered a memorable televised speech to the nation on June 11, 1963. In contrast to Eisenhower's cool aloofness from the racial question, Kennedy called the situation a moral issue and committed his personal and presidential prestige to finding a solution. Drawing on the same spiritual traditions as Martin Luther King Jr., Kennedy declared that the principle at stake is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. He called for new civil rights legislation He called for new civil rights legislation to protect black citizens. In August, King led more than 200,000 black and white demonstrators on a peaceful march on Washington in support of the proposed legislation. In an electrifying speech from the Lincoln Memorial, King declared, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Still, the violence continued. On the very night of Kennedy's stirring television address, a white gunman shot down Medgar Evers, a black Mississippi civil rights worker. In September 1963, an explosion blasted a Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls who had just finished their lesson called The Love That Forgives. Kennedy's civil rights bill made little headway in Congress in the months after his address. The killing of Kennedy, last one. Violence haunted America in the mid-1960s, and it stalked onto center stage on November 22, 1963. While riding in an open limousine in downtown Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was shot in the brain by a concealed rifleman and died within seconds. Vice President Johnson was promptly sworn in as president on a waiting airplane and flown back to Washington with Kennedy's body. As a stunned nation grieved, the tragedy grew still more unbelievable. The alleged assassin, a furtive figure named Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself shot to death in front of television cameras by his self-appointed avenger, Jack Ruby. So bizarre were the events surrounding the 2 murders that even an elaborate official investigation conducted by Chief Justice Warren could not quiet all doubts and theories about what had really happened. For several days, the nation was steeped in sorrow. Not until then did many Americans realize how fully their young, vibrant president and his captivating wife had cast a spell over them. Chopped down in his prime after only slightly more than 1,000 days in the White House, Kennedy was acclaimed more for the ideals he had enunciated and the spirit he had kindled than for the concrete goals he had achieved. In the later years, revelations about Kennedy's womanizing and allegations about his involvement with organized crime figures tarnished his reputation. But despite these accusations, his apparent vigor, charisma, and idealism made him an inspirational figure for a rising baby boom generation. Few could foresee the decade that following his death would explode into an extraordinary ferment at home and abroad. Wow! Yay!